G'day everyone, my name's Lachlan and this is Fantasy Cartography, the show where we see what maps can teach us about fantasy and what fantasy can teach us about maps. On today's episode, I'm going to introduce you to the channel, explain how Game of Thrones gets away with complexity, and get disturbingly close to the camera. So if you've clicked on this YouTube video, odds are good that you've opened at least one fantasy novel in your lifetime, and that fantasy novel probably had a map or two in its frontispiece. On this show, I'm going to be using those maps to teach you about cartography, geography, and geology. If you keep watching, you can learn about how these things work in the real world and how fantasy worlds can make use of them. You see, in case you couldn't tell, I'm a big nerd. And being a nerd, I've read a lot of fantasy novels, and I studied geology at university. But one thing that geology doesn't teach you is stories. When Newton comes up in physics class, you'll almost certainly hear the story of an apple falling on his head, even though that story is probably apocryphal. But geology doesn't have anything like that. And it's not for a lack of available stories. When I took a crystallography class, in the first lecture we were briefly introduced to Steno's law, which basically says that crystals of the same substance will all have the same internal angles. I was a little bit curious about Steno, so I looked him up and it turned out to be fascinating. Nicholas Steno didn't just invent crystallography, he also invented paleontology and stratigraphy. He had a fascinating life, but all I got as a student was, this is Steno's law. So, to keep myself amused, I would break down the geological history of fantasy world maps. I can tell you that one of my favourites at the time, Sarah Douglas's Dark Glass Mountain series, was obviously a supercontinent that had just begun to break up 5 or 10 million years ago. I'm certainly not alone among geologists in this respect either. In 2014, Stanford University did a full tectonic breakdown of Westeros from Game of Thrones, and in 2016, Chris Ingalls, an alumnus of the Australian National University Centre for the Public Awareness of Science, revolutionised our geological understanding of Middle-earth. But breaking a single fantasy map down into its component pieces is actually pretty boring stuff. You don't need to hear me drone on about subduction zones for an hour, and not every fantasy map really illustrates every geographical, cartographical principle that well anyway. Instead, what I'm going to do is start from principles. If you keep watching this show, I'll explain how to apply critical cartography to fantasy worlds, how Game of Thrones breaks the rules of civilization but it all works out anyway, and how Terry Pratchett wrote the best rivers that I've ever read. Yes, keep watching, like, subscribe. But no, what I really want to talk about here is my audience. Well, obviously everyone needs to watch this. There are two groups of people who really need to watch this. First of all, if you're interested in learning about geology, geography or cartography, then I'm here to help you guys out with the power of narrative. But the other group of people that I want to talk to are fantasy fans, especially fantasy writers. If you're interested in writing a fantasy novel or video game or even just a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, you'll probably need a map. This series isn't just going to teach you about how the real world works. You can apply these lessons the other way around as well. You can make your fantasy map and your fantasy world more believable by knowing about what does and doesn't work in the real world. Of course, you might be wondering, why should I bother with the real world? And this is a very good question. You see, this series is mostly about the medium of fantasy, and in a fantasy story you usually have access to magic. You can answer almost any question with, a wizard did it. A razor-thin mountain 10 miles high couldn't exist in the real world, but if it's supported by magic, then there's no problem. My answer would be that you can excuse a lot of things with a wizard did it, but you can't excuse everything. You see, fantasy stories are built out of shorthands. When your story has a human in it, your readers are going to assume that those humans are basically the same as an Earth human. You can't drop as an incidental detail halfway through the book that these humans actually have 8 legs and reproduce by splitting in half. You could probably build an entire sci-fi story around that twist, but if you did that, you're writing for the sake of the twist and pushing perilously close to M. Night Shyamalan territory. These shorthands don't have to be based on the real world. Thanks to the ubiquity of Lord of the Rings, pretty much everyone understands what dwarf means in a fantasy novel. Short, gruff, bearded, masculine, etc. But the further away you get from the shorthands, the more time you need to spend explaining your new ideas. Game of Thrones gets away with such a complicated plot because it's very selective about what shorthands it does and doesn't use. The power structures of the story are ripped straight out of medieval Europe, and the fantasy elements are mostly things like dragons and zombies, which pretty much everyone, at least in the Western world, understands without prompting. By contrast, both of the two most famous fantasy authors of the 20th century decided to write creation story prequels to their seminal works, explaining exactly how their world came to be. Both of them came down to a wizard did it, and both of them were terrible. And ultimately, I believe that cartography, geography and geology should all work in the same way. If you put a river in your fantasy story, the audience is going to assume that the fantasy river works in the same way as a real one. If that river suddenly doesn't work like a real one, your audience is going to be pulled out of the story and they'll start asking questions and their suspension of disbelief will come crashing down. If you put a city in the middle of a giant desert, you'll need some way of explaining why it's there, where it gets food and water, how come the people don't all die of heat stroke. You can explain these things with magic and waste valuable page space, or you can use the lessons of the real world to make your fantasy world more believable. That's it for this episode of Fantasy Cartography. You can stay until after the credits for the unrelated interesting fact of the day. Please subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button if you want Google to bother you every time I upload, and if you learned anything from this video, then please click like. The full script, including references, is available on fantasycartography.tumblr.com, and you can ask me questions using the Tumblr Ask box. You can also like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, and tell all your friends. If you think I've made any mistakes, or if there's anything you'd like me to expand on, then please email me at fantasycartography@iinet.net.au. Until next time, may your fantasy be cartographic, and your cartography be fantastical. In addition to his work on geology, Nicholas Steno was also the first Western scholar to discover that the heart was just a muscle, not a centre of reasoning or emotion. He's also been beatified by the Catholic Church, which I guess makes him almost the patron saint of stratigraphy. Bye! That's probably too disturbing.